I was driving home with a duffel and a tank half full of nerves. It was late November, the kind of night that smells like wet leaves and burnt coffee. And I had 300 miles between me and a couch that didn't feel like mine anymore. I had chosen the long route because it was faster on paper and because silence felt easier to handle in a small car than in a crowded interstate. The highway thinned out around midnight. The radio went from music to static, and my thoughts stretched thin with it. That was when the first thing that should have been minor turned into something I still carry with me. If you want to hear the whole thing, stick around until the end, subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you don't miss any of these. If this kind of true, messy travel hazard speaks to you, leave a comment with your own roadside story. It helps to know we're not the only ones who felt alone out there. The hollow pump. I pulled off at a single pump station that hadn't been updated since the 70s. Fluorescent light buzzed, and the concrete smelled of oil and something sour under it. The attendant was a man in his 50s with a blue jacket and a cigarette stub that he tapped out into a cracked ashtray. He watched me pump for a long time without saying anything, like he was waiting for something I should have known. "Long trip?" he asked finally, the gravel in his voice matching the gravel underfoot. "Yeah, trying to beat the storm," I said, because that's what people say on roads when the real answers are too heavy to explain. A truck idled behind me while I paid. Its headlights were a heat that painted the station in a different kind of night. When I looked back, the truck sat a little too close to the pumps, like it belonged there and yet wasn't using them. No one got out. He handed me the receipt without looking me in the eye. "Keep your doors locked," he said, which felt like either bad manners or a kindness. I laughed it off with a shrug and told myself I was being paranoid. I almost left without checking the rearview mirror. As I sat, the hum of the station light became a metronome. The truck's engine shifted. I glanced at my phone for the time, no bars, and the man at the window was smoking slower, watching the highway stretch into itself. Then a shape moved near the truck. 3 figures, low and quick, blanketed by the shadow between pumps and the fence. They were the kind of people the night makes anonymous. No faces from where I sat, only silhouettes that looked like they were testing the air. I tried to be casual when I got back in. I could hear my door thud and the faint scrape of gravel when someone walked too close behind my car. The truck's headlights seemed to angle toward me, as if to remind me I was visible. When I backed out, one of the silhouettes stepped in front of the truck in a slow, deliberate blocking motion. My stomach flipped. I eased forward. The silhouette didn't move. The truck honked shortly after, a low, patient sound, like a man trying not to scare a stray. I was standing between the pump and whatever those people were doing, and the empty highway behind meant my only options felt small. I told myself I'd be cool, that I'd drive as if nothing had changed, and I mashed the gas. Tires threw spray from the puddles. The truck's light cut across my hood, and then, suddenly, it was directly behind me. The engine of the big vehicle sounded enormous, a presence that made the car feel toy-sized. They followed. At first, it was a matter of keeping it smooth, nothing jerky to invite attention. Then the truck's brake lights flashed twice, like a beating heart. My pulse matched them. I kept to the speed limit. Then, once past the station, I floored it. It was stupid. I didn't plan on being chased. I just wanted the distance that felt like safety. For 20 minutes, the big rig was a constant behind me. A bar of light in my mirror, then gone, then there again. I tried to call the highway patrol on a whim. The line went straight to a recorded message about storms and delays. Finally, an off-ramp lit up a diner sign, and I took it without thinking. The truck didn't follow off the exit. It lingered on the overpass for a minute, and then, like a shadow losing its anchor, it left the road. I called the station number I still had on my receipt. The man who answered said there'd been no trouble, and that nobody matching that description had been seen since midnight. I told the operator the truck had tailgated me, and then peeled away, and then hung up with my voice small and scratched. Police took a report. They were calm and efficient, and somehow flat. They said they'd check cameras and patrol the area. The cameras, I learned later, were aimed at the pumps and not the parking lot. They found no footprints in the damp gravel, no cell records, and no witnesses who could say they'd seen anything out of the ordinary. On the drive again, the station's light burned in my rear view longer than necessary, like a glare that waited for me to look back. I told myself the truck had been a long-haul driver bored of the road, that maybe the shadows had been men fixing a tire. Those rationalizations were thin, and, when I stopped for the night, my hands trembled when I locked the car and checked the trunk twice. The taste of bad coffee lingered on my tongue the whole way to the next city. The Pines Rest. The second night was supposed to be uneventful. I had decided to avoid the interstate altogether and take the two-lane that cut through thick pines. Narrower, quieter, with pull-offs and an irony of peace I was chasing. The fog sat low between the trees and turned the road into an ink smear that swallowed anything more than a few feet ahead. My headlights sliced the haze with a white blade, and the radio found a static station full of breathy late-night DJs. I pulled into a rest area because sleep was catching up, and because rest areas feel public in a way motels don't. There was one other car tucked under the canopy of pines, older, a sedan. I told myself I would nap for 30 minutes and drive on. Sleep didn't come easily. I dozed and woke to a sound that could have been the wind at first, the sort of small noise that tricked your brain into thinking it had been asleep the whole time. Then there was another sound, a soft, deliberate knock on the roof of my car. Not the careless rap of a branch, but a single knock repeated, like knuckles counting. My head snapped up, and the interior felt impossibly bright. I sat very still and listened. The knock didn't come again. I turned on the dome light. The rest area looked empty in the way that empty places look intentionally abandoned. Trash cans upright, picnic tables half-mottled with moss, a single street lamp struggling to hold back fog. I walked the perimeter of my car with a flashlight. The other sedan was gone. The only footprints were mine and a set heading away toward the pines, quick and indistinct. A weak breeze played with a paper cup on the table. Back inside the car, everything sounded huge. The tick of the engine cooling, the creak of plastic, my own breathing. Then I noticed a long, scuffed line along the driver's side door, thin, deliberate, like something had been drawn across the paint and then drifted down the panel. It wasn't deep, but it wasn't accidental either. The key in the ignition felt flimsy in my hand. My phone registered 1 bar. I started it and rolled down the window more out of a need to hear more than to let air in. The pines pressed close. There was a rustle ahead, like someone in a jacket moving among the brush. I pulled away slow, eyes on the rear view, expecting headlights or a flash of movement. For a moment I saw nothing, then the beams of a vehicle low in the trees, then gone. On the road, the gravel sheeted my tires and tasted like metal. I kept driving until the pines thinned and a pump station appeared like an answered prayer. When I told the clerk about the knocks and the scuff, he shrugged and said hikers sometimes pass through at odd hours. I listened to that explanation while my mouth tasted of iron. I reported the scuff to the non-emergency number. An officer came out on a slow, deliberate patrol and looked at the scratch and at the photographs on my phone. No prints, he said, no witnesses. He advised driving onward, getting somewhere safe, and perhaps staying in a well-lit area. The advice was practical and small and reasonable, but it didn't make the knock on my roof stop echoing in my ears. That night, I booked a motel with lights so bright they made the room feel like a refrigerator. I left the lamp on and slept in my clothes. In the morning, the scuff looked less threatening than I remembered. Yet even months later, when I passed a stand of pines, my breath shortened in a way that felt like warning. Wrong exit. By the time the last incident happened, I promised myself I would take back roads only if they made sense. I was tired in a way that went past exhaustion. It was the kind of fatigue that made you miss cue and landmarks. Somewhere in the dark, I missed my exit and caught the sign for a small town whose name I hadn't expected. I took it because it was the only light on the map, and because staying out on the highway felt like an invitation. The town had one main street, a diner, A faded motel sign with one bulb that flickered and refused to die. When I pulled into the motel lot, the office window showed a man in a yellow sweater who moved like someone who had practiced being slow enough not to be noticed. He waved me over with the hand of a practiced host. I slouched in, offering the story about being stuck and needing a room. He typed silently into a register that looked older than my car. "There was someone out back earlier," he said, without looking up, like it wasn't a response to my question, but a piece of the air that had been waiting. "Left in a hurry." I asked what he meant. He shrugged. "Car was here an hour before you. Nobody at the desk, keys on the hook, housekeeping cleaned the towels. Nothing else." His eyes were steady and small, like the would-be light bulb in his sign. I paid cash because that felt safer, and he handed me a key that jangled with a dozen others. I parked under the wavering neon and sat for a long time. The lot was empty except for a truck parked near the dumpsters and a shadow that leaned there like a person leaning on the night. The shadow moved, and for a second I thought it was someone coming to ask for help. It wasn't. The shadow stepped into the light and then away, not toward me, but away, toward the road that led out of town. I had my bag and the key and the radio as my company. When I unlocked the room door, the hallway smelled of bleach and lemon polish, the kind of smell hotels use to say everything is in its place. I left the deadbolt on and slid a chair under the handle because the motion of taking precautions felt better than doing nothing. I kept picturing the car that had been left at the desk, keys on the hook, a person who left in a hurry. A hurried person could mean any number of things: a fight, a phone call, a run of bad luck. My imagination filled the gaps like fog. At 1 in the morning, I heard tires on gravel. Not the low rumble of a long-haul truck, but the high, quick shift of someone pulling in or leaving fast. I watched through the peephole as the truck near the dumpsters idled, then pulled slowly away. I told myself I was being foolish. Then, a shadow moved under the neon doctor's light, and people in your head become people in real life. I drove off before dawn, taking the highway back to the interstate. For the whole morning, the image of keys on a hook hovered like accusation. Anyone could come and make a claim for them. The motel clerk's indifference sat heavy with me. He had supplied facts without care, leaving the interpretation to me. When I stopped later to get coffee, a police cruiser cruised past in a bored half-turn and then sped off. They later said the motel had had transient guests and petty thefts, nothing violent. But the shape of that night sat like a bruise under my skin. Small actions and ambiguous choices that could have led to something uglier. Aftermath. After 3 nights that unspooled like one long, low-grade panic, I made a decision that felt both practical and symbolic. I stopped taking that route. I started paying for pricier hotels in towns I didn't like, so at least I would be in light and lock. I told myself I was overreacting, in the way you tell yourself you are when the rational side wants to calm the fear you can't yet name. Friends called it paranoia. One person called it wariness, which sounded more dignified. I called the police for each incident because leaving it unreported felt like inviting it back. Each time they did the job required: notes, patrols, an officer with a flashlight and a clipboard. But each time their investigation folded into the same blank. No evidence, no witnesses, as if the night had swallowed whatever had threatened me. That lack of closure grew enormous, as if a missing person note could be posted against the dark and nothing would answer it. Sleeping in daylight for weeks felt like an attempt to reset something physical in me. I found myself checking locks twice, parking under bright lights, and never, ever leaving my car unattended for long at night. My friends adapted around it, offering spare rooms and rides. I stopped talking about the nights in detail because repeating them made them matter in a new way. But I couldn't stop thinking about small signs: the hush of a station light, the scrape on a car door, the quick knock on a roof. When I drive that way now, if I must, my hands go white on the wheel at the first sign of a vehicle that seems too eager to follow.
I imagined 3 silhouettes folding into the dim and 3 stories of close calls forming a pattern that means pay attention. The road is a place that keeps giving you options until the moment it doesn't, and every small hesitation, every decision to stop or keep going becomes a choice that can tilt everything. There are things I still don't understand, and they are the worst part. Why was that truck at the pump? Who knocked on my roof, and why? Why did a motel clerk mention a car abandoned in a way that made the hair on my arms rise? The police told me what they could, which amounted to logistics and cautionary advice, but never answers. The people who chased or watched or passed through those nights remained anonymous. Shapes, sounds, a presence you couldn't quite put a finger on.
I learned to trust small, practical instincts. If a place feels wrong, leave. If a light is flickering, find a well-lit lot. Keep a charger and a physical backup plan. I learned to call out my location to someone while still on the road and to keep my keys within reach. Mostly, I learned that being careful isn't the same as being fearful. It's a way of keeping yourself in the messy business of life. But the other lesson is less tidy. It sits in the gap between what happened and what was discovered. You can escape a threat and still carry it. You can drive away from 3 nights that added up to a shape and never see the faces behind that shape. That lingering, an itch behind the eyes that wakes you before dawn, is what stayed with me. The highway didn't change, and neither did the people who occupied its shadows. I changed the way I moved through them. I don't tell these stories to frighten for the sake of it. I tell them because roads are how we get from one version of our lives to another, and sometimes the simplest crossings are the ones that cost us the most in worry and new habits. There are no satisfying endings here, no neat capture or revelation. There was only 3 nights of being very small on very long stretches of asphalt, and a choice to keep going anyway. If any of this landed with you, if you feel the same chill when the map thins and the lights go out, share a story below. Subscribe and like if you want more of these true road accounts. I post what I lived, not what I think would make a headline. Driving safe looks different for everyone, but talking about it helps. I still find myself cataloging small rituals as if they are a map back to being ordinary. I touch the door handle 3 times before I lock it. I back into parking spaces so I can see the lane behind me when I leave. I keep a metal pen where my thumb can find it in a pocket. None of these things is heroic. They are ordinary, sometimes absurd, accommodations to a world that once felt placid and became, overnight, eloquent with possibility. People ask if I feel safer now. The answer is complicated and honest. I feel safer in ways that are measurable. I sleep through more of the night, my pulse returns to a baseline that isn't constantly searching for exits, but I also feel more awake to what used to be invisible. That wakefulness comes with a strange gratitude. It teaches me about margins I didn't know I had. Margins of time, margins of proximity, margins of attention. I watch weather differently, noting wind that could mask footsteps. I time my stops so that I'm never alone at a deserted pump. There is a discipline in those margins, a kind of quiet competence. Once, returning from a conference, I let myself be reckless in a small and measured way. It was midday, and I took the long way home because I wanted to see fields I hadn't seen since childhood. The highway opened, and the sun made a promise in the glass. No shadows, no late-night hands on roofs. I drove with the windows down, the radio low, and for a stretch of 20 minutes, I could feel how little things heal when you give them a shot at it. It wasn't triumphal. It was simply proof that not every crossing forces you to reinvent how you breathe. There are people who help you build that proof. A woman named Esther, no relation, just a name I remember from a barista's apron, recognized me in a small-town diner and said quietly, "I get those nights." She didn't ask for details. She slid a thermos of coffee across the counter and, with the kind of economy that people who have been watched develop, offered to check my bag while I used the restroom. Her gesture was less about the coffee and more about the currency of ordinary kindness. Noticing, acknowledging, then doing something small to make the world marginally safer. It was a transaction I accepted because it felt sane. Writing these accounts has become a part of that repair work.
When I type, the nights transform from a relentless loop to a sequence of distinct events. 3 separate evenings, each with its own texture and set of cues. Naming the things I can name, the truck at the pump, the knock on the roof, the abandoned car, lets me put them in order rather than letting them exist as one amorphous dread. It doesn't conjure faces or explanations, but it returns to me some of the power that terror tries to take, the power to remember on my terms. Still, the itch behind the eyes is stubborn. Some mornings it wakes me before my alarm and crawls into the space behind speech, leaving a carefulness in my voice that wasn't always there. People who haven't lived through nights like those sometimes minimize the residue. They mean well when they advise resilience or suggest the practical steps I've already taken. But resilience, I have learned, is not a destination. It is a habit you practice in the small hours. Choosing lighted lots, naming an arrival time aloud to someone, parking where you can see the road behind you. These are not failures of courage, they are tactics of living. There are nights, rare and glorious, when I forget to be cautious. They are not reckless nights. They are nights where worry loosens its grip enough for joy to step in. Dinner with friends that lasts too long, a movie that makes me laugh out loud in a nearly empty theater, a drive taken because the sky looks impossibly clean. Those moments are proof that the self you feared you might lose remains intact and curious. They are interruptions in the narrative of being watched. I don't expect the unanswered questions to resolve themselves neatly. Maybe they never will. But I have learned to calibrate my life to the possibility that the world can be tender and dangerous, that you can carry caution and still move forward. The road keeps offering options. I have grown less willing to let fear choose for me entirely.
Tonight, as I pack a bag for a trip that will include a stretch of highway I once avoided, I tuck a spare battery and a laminated list of contacts into the pocket of my jacket. It feels like armor made of common sense. I lock the door, pause, and then, because rituals need counters, pull my keys out and click the fob. The lock chirps, the engine settles. I pull onto the road at dusk, not because I've vanquished the nights, but because I've accepted the terms they require. Attention without surrender, precaution without giving up going. The highway unspools, and somewhere ahead the light fades into something honest and large. I let the car find its lane, and I find mine, both of us going forward. I slowed at the rest area because my throat felt tight, and I wanted a reason to stop besides tiredness. The lot smelled of oil and wet asphalt. A young man in a reflective vest was sweeping between the pumps, his radio a low, steady companion. I killed the engine and let the quiet sit for a full minute before I moved. The safety rituals were small and precise. Hazard lights while I reached for the laminated list, one hand on the door, a glance down the road before I stepped out. They were not prayers exactly, but they were close kin, habits meant to orient me in a world that sometimes felt designed to surprise. The attendant glanced up, saw me, and gave a nod that was neither intrusive nor perfunctory. He had the spare look of people who spend their nights where other people's journeys pause. Patient, candid, the kind of person who has learned to read faces for whether to engage and when to let silence be its own kind of company. "Coffee's hot inside," he offered. "If you want it black, I won't ask about your stories." He pushed a paper cup toward me like an offering of ordinariness. I accepted it and stood at the edge of the lot, holding warmth between my palms. The highway was a ribbon of light and shadow, cars passing in pairs, each with its own private urgency. A semi rolled past with a lazy, steady hum that felt like a metronome. The stretch ahead of me, older, narrower, a place that had long been an unmarked scar in my mental map, lay dark but straightforward. In the map on my phone, it was just a line. In my history, it had kept a list of reasons to avoid it. Tonight, I measured it against the list in my pocket and chose the road. I told the attendant where I was headed. He tilted his head, as if weighing the distance, then said, "There's a good diner in Dunlow if you get hungry, open late. Folks who drive through our part like that place. The coffee's honest." He tapped the cup with a finger as if to underscore the point. I thanked him, and in that small utterance found that the language of survival had itself become social.
You thanked someone for being ordinary. They thanked you for showing up. The dusk thickened to night as I rejoined the highway.
At the margin, where the bypass narrowed into the road I had avoided, the trees leaned closer, and the air smelled of late summer, cut hay, something like petrol, the clean tang of river at a distance. My hands, which had been practiced at holding the steering wheel since those first days of caution, loosened without my planning. I did not speed, I did not rush. I drove as if the car were an instrument and I its player, attentive to minor cues, the way the tires kissed the pavement, the intermittent stutter of a distant train horn, the rhythm of my own breath. Around a bend, I passed a pickup with a flat tire, hazard lights blinking. A young woman in a bright jacket was crouched near the wheel, her phone propped against the tailgate. For a moment I considered stopping, out of reflex, out of the old habit that says help when you can. But the shoulder was narrow, and the way the land fell away made such things complicated. I slowed and pulled ahead until I had a stretch of guardrail behind me. She looked up and gave a small, grateful wave. It was enough. We exchanged that brief acknowledgement, two strangers agreeing, in the language of the road, that attention was currency. There were moments in the dark when memory came unbidden, the way, years before, a knock on a car roof had felt like thunder in a quiet night, how the sound of a single footstep on gravel could rearrange an evening. Those sounds were still possible, still in the catalog. Naming them had not made them impotent. It had simply put them in the right place, things I kept in the back of the car, accessible when needed, but not allowed to be the driver's. The back seat had room for a thermos, jumper cables, the laminated list. It did not have room for a perpetual vigilance that never slept. By the time I rolled into Dunlow, the neon sign on the diner's awning was half burned, the letters giving up in places, but still legible enough to be invited. Inside, the place hummed with the soft domesticity of late-night patrons, a man in a ball cap eating pie at the counter, two nurses nursing their last coffees before a shift, a couple of teenagers laughing too loudly at a shared phone screen. I found a seat by the window and watched headlights as if they were small translations of what I'd been carrying all evening. The waiter, a woman with a silver streak in her hair and the economy of motion of someone who had worked 1,000 closing shifts, brought a pot of coffee and a paper-wrapped fork. "You're on the road tonight?" she asked, pouring without fuss. "Yes," I said. The one-syllable answer felt sufficient, and the question wasn't a prying one. It was a shape in which others could hang their own stories. "You from around here?" the man next to me asked, gesturing with a fork toward the highway. He had the blunt, conversational manner of people who spend a lot of time in transit. "We got a lot of folks coming through, keeping their eyes on the lines." "I grew up not far off," I said.
I avoid that stretch sometimes. He nodded as if he knew what that meant. There's pieces of road like that. You get used to them being stories you tell yourself. Then one night you decide you can tell a different story. He looked at me as if measuring whether my face would translate into that possibility. Good for you. We ate pie. The pie was unassuming, apricot, a little tart, a perfect utensil for a night that needed to be tasted rather than explained. Conversation leaked into small local things. The high school's Friday game scoreboard, a new family that had moved into a nearby farmhouse, the way the river had flooded a field earlier in the summer and left it plated with silt. These were not grand consolations. They were reminders that life is built of small, shared details that make nights less monastic and more human. When I drove back onto the highway, the night seemed less like an arena and more like a place with rules you could follow. The radio was a quiet companion again, and a song came on that had no particular message but sounded like permission. Two chords that allowed the chest to let itself be heavier and then lighter. I thought of Esther, of the stranger at the pump, of the attendant whose radio hummed as he swept. Each one had offered the same basic thing, to witness. Witnessing, I was discovering, was not an act that required explanation. It was an economy of presence. It gave back to a person the right to be more than the worst thing that had happened to them. I rolled into the town where I'd reserve a room for the night.
The motel's fluorescent sign buzzed. A man at the desk was half asleep, fingers resting on a keyboard as if waiting for it to do more of the work than keys do. The room was modest. A lamp that threw a warm circle across the bed, a kettle on a small counter, a painting above the headboard of a lake at sunset. The room smelled faintly of detergent and the ghosts of other travelers. I did the things I'd learned to do: lock the door, wedge the deadbolt, point the peephole, then turned off the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed with the laminated list heavy in my hand. I let myself count the good small objects: the spare battery in my jacket, the thermos from the diner still warm with coffee, the phone with its contacts, the minor lights of civilization outside the window. They were not talismans that guaranteed safety. They were practical survivor's equivalents: a bed, flat, useful, something that belonged to the order of living. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly, music leaking out like a soft animal. The night would include sleep if I let it, and sleep now felt like a deliberate act of faith rather than a reckless surrender. I lay back and let the ceiling be an unremarkable plane. The itch behind my eyes was there, as it had been since those first nights, an old, reliable companion, but its edges were blunted. I breathed with an awareness that was not frantic.
The road had been traveled. The stretch I had once avoided had been crossed. The small acts of attention and kindness continued to stack into a structure that supported me. It was not a story of overnight healing. It was a ledger of small repairs, each entry adding to a balance of nights that, incrementally, felt more like living and less like an endurance test. I set my phone to silent and placed it face down on the bedside table. The laminated list lay beside it, a small rectangle of paper and clear plastic that contained names that were now also a part of my nighttime architecture. I thought, as one does in a room alone, of the improbable kindnesses that brick by brick had allowed me to continue. The barista with an apron named Esther, the attendant with the sweeping radio, the young woman at the roadside who had waved from her flatty. I felt the truth of something ordinary and stubborn, that people notice each other more often than the worst parts of ourselves allow us to believe. Outside, the highway kept going, a river of small lamps that moved through the dark with indifferent grace. I let my body match its rhythm, slow and steady, and as sleep began to pull me toward it, I made an intention as plain as a small tracked step: to keep going the way I had tonight. Not because danger had vanished, not because the past had been rewritten, but because I had chosen, again and again, to accept the terms of living: care without capitulation, caution without seclusion, movement without the insistence that fear must be the navigator. When the room finally surrendered me to sleep, it felt like a truce more than a victory. The road would be there in the morning, and there would be more small decisions to make. For now, the engine of my life, practiced, careful, flawed, was idle, and that idleness felt enough.